manage your own army, participate in exciting battles, subjugate other races, develop your own fortress. Well, the hero of our story has such an opportunity because he had the system of the Almighty Lord. With its help, he could develop his warriors and discover new technologies. Fascinating development, capturing fortresses, fighting for territories, a lot of unique races, epic battles that take your breath away, and much more. That's what you will see in this story. Let's start at the beginning, with the moment when our hero Richard arrives in the city of Solon. After being transported to this world, he finds himself in the body of a bastard of the famous Orlando family. Richard has many reasons for being in this city. He hopes to start a new chapter in his life here, armed with the system of the Supreme Overlord. Upon arriving at the City Lord's chambers, he learns the bad news that his father, Calvin Orlando, has died. Richard's half-brother, Winger Orlando, now sees him as a threat. But Richard remains indifferent. The Lord, glaring, demands that Richard give up the Orlando name and assist Winger in removing any obstacles. If Richard agrees, Winger will give him 500 gold coins to support his new territory. When a box is presented to him, Richard opens it to find a pile of gold coins. A satisfied smile crosses his face as he realizes this will be perfect as the starting capital for his new life. Relieved that a deal has been made, the Lord relaxes. But Richard isn't content with just the money. He calmly states that the Orlando name holds great honor and glory, the most valuable legacy left by his father. Surrendering it would require more compensation. The Lord, momentarily taken aback, quickly offers 1,000 gold coins with no interest, on the condition that Richard buys everything from the city. Richard agrees and asks if the Lord has a group of barbarian Highlander slaves in the Colosseum. The Lord, understanding Richard's plan to use them as troops, warns that taming these barbarians will be difficult. Even with 1,000 gold coins, they might not obey him. Richard, having done his homework, is undeterred. The Lord then orders his men to escort him to the arena. As he rides in the chariot, he reflects on his 10 years of life in this world, sometimes missing his once happy life. When a servant asks about the tune he is humming, he vaguely replies that it's just a simple song from his hometown. The scene shifts to a deeper exploration of Richard's past. He was once homeless, killed as a thief, and discarded like trash. After reincarnating, he took over the host's body and acquired the mighty Lord system, growing stronger each day. Initially, he aimed to become a knight, but his father's sudden decision to pass on his title to Richard disrupted those plans. Fortunately, he obtained the certificate of pioneering lordship in time and fled to Solon City, escaping his family's wrath. At the Colosseum, he informs the owner that he wants to purchase all the barbarians to form troops and expand his territories. The owner, thrilled at the prospect of a large sale, eagerly leads them inside. As they walk through the corridor, the owner warns him that the barbarians are fierce and often injure other fighters, costing her a fortune in medical expenses. She advises caution, but his interest only grows as he observes the monstrous creatures lining the corridor. His excitement peaks when the owner mentions that the barbarians can slaughter and eat crocodiles. Impressed by their self-sufficiency and fighting prowess, his determination to subdue them intensifies. The owner wonders if he is crazy, unaware that he possesses the most powerful lord system on the continent. As he reviews the system's attributes, he feels ready to showcase the results of his hard work over the past 3 years. Reaching the high platform of the Beast Arena, he loudly announces to the barbarians below that he has purchased all of them. Knowing they won't easily submit, he proposes a wrestling match. The winner gains freedom, while the loser becomes his subordinate. A hulking barbarian named Russell steps forward to challenge him. Muscles bulging with power, Russell prepares for the match. Meanwhile, the platform owner, drenched in sweat, fears the repercussions if anything happens to Richard on her territory. She quickly orders her attendants to persuade him to reconsider, but he insists he is following the city lord's orders and has no right to interfere. As Richard braces for the fight, the barbarians mock him, laughing at the little boy who dares to challenge Russell. One even warns Russell to go easy, fearing problems if the aristocrat dies, but Russell is determined to show no mercy. The fight begins with Russell charging at Richard, headbutting him with brutal force. He grabs Richard by the shirt and slams him to the ground with a resounding bang. As Richard lies on the ground, Russell sneers, disappointed that it took only one move to defeat him. The barbarians cheer while the platform owner despairs, fearing her Colosseum might be shut down for good. But then, Richard grabs Russell's foot and slowly stands up with a smug grin. He had let Russell make the first move, not wanting to be accused of bullying. With a powerful punch to Russell's stomach, he sends the barbarian crashing to the ground. Russell, stunned, struggles to comprehend how an aristocrat could withstand his attacks. Meanwhile, Richard begins radiating a golden fire, a skill honed over the years through the Lord system. How could he lose to someone with such poor skills? Enraged, Russell charges again, but this time Richard effortlessly flips him over his shoulder and slams him to the ground. Now Russell finds himself pinned under Richard's foot, unable to believe he has been bested by a thin aristocrat. Refusing to admit defeat, Russell stands up, determined to re-challenge Richard. Calm and confident, Richard agrees to another round. The other barbarians can't bear to watch. Richard grabs Russell and repeatedly slams him into the ground, asking if he still hasn't given up. Bruised and swollen, Russell stubbornly refuses to tap out. The other barbarians urge him to surrender, pointing out that he has already lost 10 times. Even Russell is shocked at the outcome. Just then, a female barbarian steps forward, proposing a fight with Richard. As the leader of the barbarians, she seeks to free her people by defeating him. Richard, excited by the challenge, declares that the real show is about to begin. Gunther, the barbarian leader, attacks with lightning speed, catching Richard off guard. Suddenly, the system alerts Richard. The barbarian leader, named Gunther, has been detected as a hero. Distracted by the alert, Richard is hit by Gunther's steel fist, forcing him to stumble back. Despite standing his ground, Richard is curious about Gunther. He has never encountered a hero of her rank before. But Gunther doesn't give him time to recover, launching a relentless series of strikes. The barbarians cheer wildly, and even Richard's followers feel uneasy. Gunther's assault is just the beginning. She picks up a massive rock and hurls it at Richard. With a loud crash, Richard is buried under the rock. The Colosseum owner worries that a lord has just been stoned to death in her arena. Gunther stands proudly, but then a voice emerges from beneath the rock, shocking everyone, including Gunther. Richard pushes the rock away, and Gunther swiftly moves to his side, wrapping an iron chain around his neck and slamming him to the ground. Richard doesn't struggle but seems satisfied with Gunther's performance. With a light pull, he snaps the chain apart, shocking the barbarians. Even Gunther is stunned. Top craftsmen forged this chain to restrain giant beasts, and even she had been trapped by it for years. Yet Richard broke it effortlessly with his bare hands. Impressed by her strength and strategy, Richard sees Gunther as the perfect subordinate. But Gunther feels mocked. Furious, she demands that Richard respect her and give his all in their battle. Richard calmly replies that she is still chained, unable to fully unleash her power. Now, it is his turn to show what he is truly capable of. He raises his right fist, gathering strength, and lunges forward, his fist slicing through the air. Gunther blocks, but Richard follows with a crushing overhead strike. The ground shatters on impact, and Gunther barely dodges. The barbarians watch in awe as their chief is overwhelmed by Richard's strength. Suddenly, Richard grabs Gunther's throat. She struggles but can't break free. As Richard raises his left hand to strike, Gunther closes her eyes, expecting the end. But instead of hitting her, he shatters the iron ring on her body. Stunned, Gunther's heart races as she processes what just happened. After taking down the female leader, Richard turns to the barbarians and gives them a choice. They can continue challenging him or choose to follow him. Richard extends his hand as a sign of cooperation. Gunther takes his hand and stands up, declaring that Richard is now their new leader. Richard announces that he will become the Supreme Lord and needs their strength to grow together. The barbarians, initially uncertain, eventually shout their agreement to join him, follow his orders, and call him their boss. Amidst the cheers, Richard receives a prompt from the system. As he looks at the flood of requests to join his team, Richard realizes he has officially taken the first step in his journey toward becoming the Supreme Lord. But the journey through this wild world is fraught with chaos and bloodshed. Countless ambitious individuals have risen to become lords, crafting their own realities. Yet, most of them met their end in despair, leaving this world behind. Though Richard eagerly anticipated his future adventures, he knew it wouldn't be wise to stroll through the streets with a group of half-naked barbarians. So, he led them to the city's equipment store. As they entered, the barbarians were as excited as children, marveling at the dazzling array of gear. Richard, however, didn't even glance at the display. He went straight to the owner, Negan Dwarf, explaining that he was there to outfit his brothers, having heard that the shop offered top-quality weapons. Sensing he was dealing with an expert, the owner pressed a button on the wall. The building's walls rotated, revealing an impressive arsenal of weapons. Richard asked the owner to equip each of his men with a lance and 3 throwing spears. After a quick calculation, the owner informed him that the total cost would be 750 gold coins. But Richard only produced a few gold coins. The owner, sneering with contempt, was about to press the button to close the door and dismiss him, mocking him for being poor. Gunther, seeing this, began to protest, but Richard calmly told her to wait. He then pulled out a legendary piece of equipment, the Dragon Slayer sword, and handed it over. The owner, trembling with excitement, realized that the man before him must be someone important to possess such a weapon. He immediately agreed to let Richard purchase everything on credit. Richard returned the sword and instructed the barbarians to take a lance, 3 throwing spears, and leather armor each. Negan Dwarf couldn't refuse and ordered his employees to quickly equip everyone. The barbarians, now armed and outfitted, were ecstatic. At this point, Gunther approached Richard and asked about their next move. Richard smirked and said they were about to claim a land that rightfully belonged to them. As Richard and his group set out to find a territory, someone watched them from afar through binoculars. It was the Goblin Chief, Harrison. Beside him stood the Gnoll Chief, whose jackal army was ambushed on a nearby hill. They were eager to loot the supplies and weapons from Richard's troop. The Gnoll Chief was impatient to attack, confident in their numbers, which outmatched Richard's group 5-1. But Goblin Harrison, assuming Richard was brainless, ordered them to hold off until Richard's group ventured deeper into the hinterland. Meanwhile, Gunther had already sensed that something was off. She reported her suspicions to Richard, who was aware of the possibility of a monster ambush. She asked if he had a plan. Richard turned to his group and commanded them to halt. He instructed them to form a circle with the carriages, securing the livestock and goods inside in preparation for an imminent attack. Without delay, he retrieved a bag of pills and distributed them, explaining that these were oriental elixirs designed to enhance their strength. He urged them to take the pills quickly and get ready for the battle ahead. Most of the group swallowed the pills immediately, while a few remained skeptical. Richard reassured them, insisting that their boss was trustworthy. In truth, the pills were nothing but flower balls, a ruse to cover up the power of the Lord system. Richard opens the system panel and sees that most of the barbarians are third-level spearmen, except for Gunther, who stands out as an independent hero unit. The system is incredibly powerful, making it possible for units to level up quickly through constant battles. If the barbarians had figured this out, it could have caused a riot, so Richard cleverly used dumplings as a distraction. Holding a magic pill in his hand, he whispers that soon everyone will experience its power. Meanwhile, the goblins and jackals watching them notice the barbarians have stopped moving. The Gnoll declares that it's time for their enemies to die. The Golden Chief punches him in the chest, questioning why he seems so pleased. The Gnoll guesses the barbarians might be protected by something sacred, but the goblin chimes in, saying the barbarians have stopped because they're scared of the goblin's strength and have decided to surrender. Unimpressed, the Gnoll yells that they don't care about that and commands his troops to attack and loot the barbarians. As the monsters charge down from the hill, Richard quickly orders his army to get ready for their first battle. The Gnoll, eager for bloodshed, instructs his forces to kill everyone before taking any loot. The fight is about to break out, with both sides gearing up for the clash. Richard grabs a spear and hurls it at the approaching enemy with incredible speed. The spear cuts through the air, heading straight for Chief Harrison. He easily deflects it by raising his armored arm, and the spear flies off, piercing a goblin's skull in the distance. Harrison tells his army that while their opponents are strong, they aren't strong enough to be feared. He shouts to his men that they outnumber the enemy by a wide margin and urges them to attack all at once. Richard's side is clearly at a disadvantage because of the difference in numbers. The barbarians start to lose confidence and doubt their abilities. One of them mutters that no matter how strong they are, they can't possibly defeat such a large army. A jackal attacks, but one of the barbarians knocks it down with a punch. Another barbarian stabs a jackal in the stomach with his weapon. The jackals, being relentless, start killing the barbarians. A massive goblin fights several barbarians at the same time. Russell and another barbarian find themselves surrounded by goblins and jackals. Russell swings his weapon at the jackals, calling them dogs, but 3 jackals attack him at once. Meanwhile, another giant goblin grabs a barbarian with one hand and squeezes him so hard that the barbarian's body bursts like a bubble. Gunther sees what's happening and asks Richard what they should do. Richard orders Gunther to hand him another spear. Then he attaches a flaming spearhead and launches it at a troll on the other side. The spear hits its mark, killing the troll instantly and frightening the other monsters, causing them to retreat. At the same time, the successful attack boosted the morale of Richard's side. With the system's blessing on their side, the barbarians began to fight more bravely. Suddenly, Russell also stood up, slamming the jackals that pounced at him. Just then, the Gnoll Chief appeared behind him, ready to deliver a fatal blow, but Richard had already thrown a spear that pierced through the Gnoll Chief's body. Right after that, Richard drew his Dragonslayer sword and shouted that the leaders of the bandits were dead and that the enemy had lost their fighting spirit. He urged his men to take advantage of this moment and launch a full-scale attack. Encouraged by his words, the barbarians' spirits soared, and they started to dominate the battle. Gunther realized that Richard had been targeting the enemy leaders all along, and that standing on the carriage gave him a better view of the battlefield. Richard quoted an old saying, "To capture bandits, first catch the leader." Now, only Chief Harrison's army remained, the ones who had originally planned the ambush. The goblin clenched his teeth, calling the barbarians a bunch of losers and ordinary people, urging them to see the consequences of their actions. A foul, poisonous green energy began to radiate from him. Richard noticed this and remarked that the goblin seemed like a chief. He then questioned if the goblin had planned this ambush and wondered if he wasn't afraid of falling into the hands of more powerful races. The goblin leader laughed, explaining that the closest threat was at the high mountain fortress, several miles to the east. It was a place that was easy to defend and hard to attack. Besides, he doubted the kobolds there had the courage to come out and steal his loot. Richard was surprised by this unexpected opportunity. He had been worried about not finding a suitable territory. With a sly grin, he said he felt bad that the goblin leader couldn't get his spoils, so he would give him the Dragon Slayer's sword as a gift instead. Harrison immediately became alert and prepared to defend himself. But in the blink of an eye, Richard swung his sword, decapitating him. The other goblin minions were stunned and began to flee. Taking advantage of the situation, Gunther quickly ordered the capture of the remaining bandits. Richard checked the system notifications and saw that most of the barbarians had leveled up from level 3 to level 4. The nearby barbarians felt their newfound strength, believing it was due to a mysterious oriental pill. Just then, his men brought in 2 captured trolls. Seeing that the horses were dead, Richard decided the trolls would pull the supplies instead, declaring them the new marshals. As Richard studied the map, he noted that their next destination was the high mountain fortress. A large troll pulled a cart behind him, with Richard sitting on it, studying a map. He noted that this troll was quite fast, and at this pace, they would soon reach the high mountain fortress. The system panel appeared in front of him again, displaying his various stats, including weapons. Richard realized that each improvement gave him bonus points for his personal attributes. The store button was still inactive, and he needed to increase his power and throwing skills first. Weapon mastery could be enhanced through battles, but his attribute bonuses were natural, with no magical abilities involved. Being 10 times stronger than an ordinary person, he wondered if he'd keep getting stronger, imagining himself becoming a muscular giant. Just then, Gunther informed him they had arrived at the base of the high mountain fortress. Richard stood up, taking in the view of the mountain's base, the calm water, and the greenery around them. He commented that it wasn't such a bad place. Seeing the clear water in a nearby pool, a group of barbarians jumped in and began washing themselves, causing Gunther to feel a bit embarrassed. 2 barbarians approached with dead rabbits, noting the abundance of wildlife and suggesting they go on a big hunt. Richard thought they had impressive survival skills. Richard noticed Gunther sniffing her hand and suggested she take a bath and rest after their recent battles. He mentioned a hidden pond nearby and assured her he would keep an eye on the barbarians. Gunther, blushing and grateful, thanked him. Later, in a secluded green spot surrounded by stones, Gunther bathed in the hidden pond, relaxing and enjoying a well-deserved break. Under the cover of the night, Richard and his group made their way to the mountaintop and found the high mountain fortress. Richard announced to everyone that this place would be their new base camp. Seeing the 2 kobolds guarding the entrance, Richard and Russell exchanged a look of disdain. Without hesitation, Richard gave the order to attack. Inside the fortress, the kobold leader was relaxing with his catfolk companion. At that crucial moment, Richard kicked the door open. The kobolds were so startled they stuck out their tongues and began yelling for the guards. Just then, one of Richard's men reported that all the kobolds outside had been dealt with. Furious, the kobold leader glared at Richard and said attacking his forces was a huge mistake. He warned that he had a dozen allied tribes nearby who wouldn't let this attack go unpunished. But Richard wasn't interested in listening. He immediately tied the kobold leader up and hung him in the air. Terrified, the kobold quickly apologized. Seeing that he was now submissive, Richard untied him and let him go. As the kobold fled, he glared back at Richard with a look of hatred and vowed to get revenge. One of the barbarians commented that he hadn't expected them to capture the high mountain fortress so easily, but Gunther replied that the kobolds were useless. Richard told everyone that the fortress was spacious, had a wide field of view and plenty of water. The open view allowed them to see for miles around. After a while, Richard pulled out a map and called everyone together for their first combat meeting. A nearby barbarian asked if they really needed to fight again. Richard explained that there must be a reason why such a good location was occupied by a weak group like the kobolds. It was likely that there were more kobold troops in the surrounding area. Russell chimed in, warning that since they had released the kobold leader earlier, he might come back with reinforcements. Richard replied that he had spent a lot of money equipping everyone with weapons and gear. This time, instead of seeking out enemies one by one, they would let them come to them. They would wait for the enemy to gather, and then take them all out at once to make more profit. After settling into the fortress, the troops celebrated. However, Gunther turned to Richard and asked why the bandits hadn't made a move despite the time that had passed. Richard, enjoying his meal, replied that she was being too impatient and suggested they wait a bit longer. The peaceful days lasted only 2 days. Richard's men soon discovered a large army stationed not far from the fortress. Wiping his mouth, Richard smiled slyly and said it was time to take action since their fortune had come to them that night. Using binoculars, Richard scanned the enemy camp and saw the goblins sleeping. Seizing this opportunity to assert control over the high mountain fortress, he decided to act. He instructed that only Gunther's squad would join him in the attack, while the rest of the barbarians and the trolls would stay behind to guard the fortress. The barbarians agreed, and Richard suggested they finish the job quickly. As the barbarians approached the sleeping goblins in their tents, Gunther opened one of the tents and swiftly killed the goblin inside with her sword. The noise woke the other goblins and a battle erupted. Watching his troops move in an organized manner, Richard quietly opened his system panel. The system had given them more than just strength. Before, they were a group of simple-minded barbarians who didn't understand the importance of coordination. Now they had become an elite force capable of forming effective battle formations. Suddenly, Russell noticed something strange as the ground began to shake violently. He was thrown aside as a massive goblin with 2 horns, the Dragon Goblin, emerged. The Dragon Goblin started chanting spells, and goblins began popping up from the ground like groundhogs. This sight frightened everyone, including Richard, who realized that the situation was becoming more challenging than expected. But that wasn't all. The goblins let out another loud roar, and a massive beast resembling a pangolin appeared, lifting the Dragon Goblin onto its back. The sight of this enormous creature terrified the barbarians again. A goblin riding the pangolin mocked them, calling them stupid losers. He then pointed his weapon at them and demanded they be punished by the power of the dragon's blood. Gunther was ready for action. She threw a spear directly at the beast. However, as soon as the spear touched the creature, it bounced off harmlessly. The goblin laughed wickedly, taunting her that her flimsy spear was no match for his beast's armor. He called her a loser and declared she would soon understand the power of dragon blood before launching an attack. As Gunther watched, the creature charged at her with incredible speed. Right in the middle of the crisis, Richard dashed in front of Gunther and grabbed the beast's leg with both hands. The beast looked down at Richard in disdain, intending to throw him off. But with a yell, Richard threw the goblin off the beast, causing the monster to crash heavily to the ground. The surrounding goblins were stunned and began screaming in fear. Russell couldn't help but wonder at Richard's strength. The dragon goblin, struggling to get up, muttered that this couldn't be happening. Richard grinned at the mention of noble dragon blood, and sarcastically suggested that the goblin's nobility might surrender. Furious, the goblin gritted his teeth, grabbed his weapon, and lunged at Richard, swearing never to give up. Richard swiftly dodged the attack and delivered a powerful punch to the goblin's face. Still defiant, Richard adjusted his cloak and walked away confidently, reminding everyone that he had finished the fight as quickly as he had promised. Meanwhile, Richard checks the characteristics window as the barbarians celebrate having a weapon with dragon blood. He noticed that his levels had increased, and he gained 175 experience points. Deciding to use these points, Richard allocated them to enhance Gunther's strength. Gunther called Richard over, showing him the pangolin they had captured and tied up. She offered it to him as a gift. Nearby, some barbarians opened large boxes that contained only 2 gold coins, revealing their dire financial situation. Richard chuckled, and remarked that it seemed the goblins were also having a tough time. Gunther then asked what they should do with the monster. Richard, considering the pangolin's potential meat, patted it on the head and named it Wind Chaser. He set a clear condition. If the beast disobeyed, it would be served as food for everyone. Just then, Richard noticed the store icon was now available. He saw an old-fashioned knight spear priced at 800 dinars. Since his wallet was empty, he could only choose weapons at a discount. After making the purchase, a light shone over Richard, and the knight's spear appeared before him. Catching it, he realized he was finally starting to understand how the system worked. Gunther asked if the boss could even use special magic. At that moment, Richard sensed some movement nearby. A barbarian informed him that it looked like a group of jackals engaged in a robbery. Richard scanned the area with his binoculars and spotted a wealthy caravan, remarking that it was no wonder the jackals were attracted to it. The caravan, loaded with carts and horses, was surrounded, and its defenders were preparing for a fierce attack. Gunther asks him if they should step in. Richard points out that this isn't just any caravan, and helping them could be good for their business and help expand their territory. At the same time, the leader of the jackals demands that the people hand over all their money, claiming they're in jackal territory now. An old man from the caravan responds that they are with the Voya Trading Company, and warns that if they are harmed, the Imperial Army will come after them. The jackals just laugh at this. Their leader, smirking, says they're bandits. Do they really think mentioning the Pompel Empire will scare them? With that, he orders his men to attack the wealthy caravan. One of the caravan's defenders tries to hold off the jackals and urges the old man to run. But before he can escape, an attacker strikes the old man from behind. He falls to the ground, bleeding, pleading for mercy, saying he'll give them the money. The jackal leader scoffs, saying it's too late for mercy. No one is coming to save him. Suddenly, a spear flies through the air and pierces the leader's chest. He coughs up blood and everyone is stunned. Richard, who threw the spear, comments on how well it performs. Gunther immediately commands his barbarians to kill the jackals. The barbarians obey, charging into battle without hesitation. The jackals are caught off guard and have no idea who these attackers are. Richard, leaning casually against a tree, remarks that these jackals are just a bunch of bandits and decides he'll just watch this time as the barbarians take them down. Gunther confidently orders his men to split into 2 groups. Richard observes that while the barbarians are strong, as a leader, he values a disciplined army, which he believes is crucial for their future battles. All the jackals were defeated, with only 2 still standing. One of them decided to make a run for it, which annoyed the other. He shouted, asking if his companion was really running away. The one trying to escape replied that if he hadn't figured it out yet, Richard and the barbarians would have destroyed the alliance between the goblins, gnolls, and jackals. The other jackal then realized the truth, exclaiming that Richard, the legendary noble known as the Lord of the Wild, had appeared out of nowhere. He finally understood their dire situation, and yelled that they were doomed, and they'd better run. Both jackals sprinted away as fast as they could, but suddenly, a windmill emerged from the ground and knocked them aside. A monster then captured the 2 jackals. Richard was confident that his army could handle the rest of the jackals without his help. They were no longer the disorganized group they once were. A barbarian finished off the last jackal and reported back to Richard. A merchant approached Richard, thanking him for his help and calling him a warrior, promising to spread the word of his bravery. Richard, not one to be modest, replied that if they wanted to repay him, they should do so with money. The merchant was taken aback by this response. Then, a girl with long golden hair stepped out of a cart, and, with a sly smile, commented that, as expected from a greedy aristocrat, Richard was indeed fascinating. A merchant girl from the Voya Trading Company steps out of the cart and introduces herself as Annie. She turns to the man behind her, calling him Rudo, and asks if he's all right. Rudo nods, saying he is fine. Annie bows and thanks Richard and the barbarians for rescuing them. Richard laughs and boasts that his soldiers are brave and that the jackals are no challenge for them. Meanwhile, the barbarians standing nearby mutter among themselves, calling Richard arrogant and complaining about how he never praises them during normal times. Annie addresses Richard as Lord and says she has a request for him. Richard asks what she needs. Annie explains that they have suffered heavy losses and that many of their people are injured or dead, making it impossible for them to complete their trade deals with the remaining caravans. She hopes they can stay with Richard and his group for a while. Richard replies without any sympathy that staying on his estate is expensive, bragging that it's known as a 5-star heart back in his homeland. Annie responds that she intends to pay with money and weapons. She then orders Rudo to bring an item. Rudo presents a turquoise ball with stars on it. Richard asks what it is, and Annie tells him to watch closely. The ball floats into the air and grows larger. Annie explains that it is a communication crystal, which she uses to send a message to their trading house for help. Richard asks when their reinforcements will arrive. She replies that it will take at least 3 days, as they are too far from Horan. The cunning Richard is still convinced that this is no ordinary caravan. He sees an opportunity to make a lot of money once their business begins. He tells them to come along, declaring that he, Richard, the Lord of the Highland Fortress, will never turn away friendly guests. Annie thanks him for his kindness. They soon arrive at the fortress. Richard observes the caravan members setting up on the street, tending to the wounded by bandaging their injuries. Annie instructs Rudo to give a healing potion to the injured soldiers. She pours a blue liquid from a vial into a large bucket. As he watches, Richard realizes that this is a legendary healing potion, one that is out of his reach due to his lower status. This potion, blessed by a high-level magician and strengthened with mid-level magic, can heal wounds instantly. Richard recalls all the details he knows about this potion, especially its high cost, and realizes, as he suspected, that this is indeed a very special caravan. As night falls, Annie asks Rudo if he has checked on all the victims. He responds that while they have no shortage of money or supplies, half of their group is either injured or dead. Annie reacts with sadness, lamenting over the loss of so many lives. Rudo reassures her, saying that they were fortunate Richard saved them, otherwise the situation could have been much worse. Annie turns to Rudo and asks what he thinks of Richard. Rudo replies with admiration, noting that Richard is indeed a formidable lord. When the jackals attacked, their situation seemed dire, but then Richard's soldiers appeared and completely reversed the odds. His troops fought with such strength and skill that they were clearly a cut above the rest. Annie agrees wholeheartedly, acknowledging that their survival was entirely thanks to Richard and his impressive forces. At this moment, Richard thinks about the caravan's well-equipped soldiers. Their gear appears even more impressive compared to his 4 barbarians, who are currently fighting over weapons they can't seem to share. Watching them, Richard reflects on how he managed to acquire the caravan's armor without spending a penny, and received Fred's battle axe as a reward from the system. With a smile, he concludes that his soldiers have also grown stronger. Suddenly, Gunther approaches him and urgently says something is wrong. Richard, noticing her panic, asks what's going on. The barbarians also turn to listen. Gunther finally explains that she saw a large, armed group of half-human, half-horse beings heading their way. Richard is confused at first, wondering what she means by half-humans and half-horses. As he looks out, he sees people with the torsos of horses coming towards them. These centaurs are approaching the gate, led by a silver-haired girl at the front. Her name is Heather, from the Gale clan, and she holds a sword in her hand. Suddenly, spears fly toward them, landing heavily on the ground nearby. Heather notices the force behind the throws and orders her group to keep moving forward. Richard, holding a spear, is surprised that they are ignoring his warnings. He hurls another spear with all his strength, and the barbarians do the same. One of the spears flies directly at Heather, but she deflects it, slicing the spear in half with her sword. She then orders her group to stop, realizing it's too dangerous to continue at this range. Heather pulls out a white handkerchief, ties it around her sword, and raises it, waving it as a sign of surrender. Gunther remarks to Richard that this centaur is clever, then turns to him and suggests that they may have surrendered. Richard says they should probably go meet them, but he orders the barrier gate to remain closed since their true intentions are still unclear. Richard approaches Heather and asks her to explain the reason for their visit. Heather bows and introduces herself as the leader of the Gale clan, saying they have come with good intentions. Richard introduces himself as the Lord of the Highland Fortress. Heather quickly asks if he is truly the invincible Richard from the martial arts competition in the southern province. Richard smiles and asks if she has heard of him. She replies that his reputation has spread far and wide, and even the Gale clan, who live in the wilderness, has heard of his feats. Richard gives a charming smile and says that his reputation is exaggerated. Heather then holds out a piece of wood and tells him they have come to share important news. Richard takes the board and asks what it says, admitting he can't make out any of the writing. Heather explained that the local people were planning to raise an army and sent her this invitation as a warning. Some of the other barbarians gather around Richard as Heather continues, explaining that the Highland Fortress once belonged to kobolds. Now that an army is forming, Gunther interrupts, pointing out that the locals have always hated their conquerors and assumes Richard knows what that means. Richard grips the board with one hand and crushes it into pieces. He states that the locals want to reclaim the Highland Fortress. Heather nods, confirming he's right, and adds that the kobolds have also enlisted the help of shamans and sorcerers, whose powers should not be underestimated. Richard starts to reply, but Heather bows and kneels, placing her hand on her chest in a gesture of respect. She openly offers her clan's help, recognizing the great challenges he will face. Richard asks why they are willing to help him, instead of those who want to take back the fortress. Heather explains that the Gale clan once belonged to the Orc kingdom and never allied with the locals or became bandits. She then shares the story of her tribe, where everyone worked in the fields and lived a peaceful life. Her people were known for their good manners and had a rich culture of poetry and chronicles. Some were painters, while others played musical instruments. Now they hope to align themselves with a powerful lord to restore the glory days of their clan. Richard looks out the window and comments that the Gale clan really wants to join, as the system has received their request. He checks Heather's profile, noting that she is afraid of fire and skilled with both long and short bows, as well as a heavy machete. He observes that these centaurs are capable of fighting from a distance. He leads Heather and her clan to the estate and introduces Heather as the leader of the Gale clan. He admits that they have received some troubling news. Annie asks what makes the news so terrible. Richard explains that the kobolds and jackals will soon declare war on them again. Alarmed, Annie asks how soon Richard thinks this will happen. Richard considers for a moment and then estimates they have about 10 days. Hearing this, Annie and Rudo become anxious about what to do next, while Gunther and Russell are excited at the prospect of more battles. Heather reports that although the locals have formed an army, it is made up of various races. They have organized their efforts, dividing tasks and preparing food for the troops, who will need at least 10 days to arrive. Richard states that even though the enemy is formidable, they have 10 days, and that's plenty of time. He pulls out a map, spreads it on the table, and tells everyone that he has devised a strategy to defeat their foes. Gunther cheers up and eagerly asks if the boss already has a plan. He wonders if he can share it with everyone. The boss replies that they'll find out when the time is right, and for now, they shouldn't worry. Turning to Annie, the boss says that to face such a strong enemy, he has a favor to ask of her. She tells him to go ahead. He then asks to borrow 500 gold coins. Without hesitation, she calmly says it's not a problem, and if it helps, she'll just give him the 500 gold coins. Richard, bowing slightly, says the Highland Fortress will always appreciate her generosity. Later that night, while examining weapons from his system, Richard asks Heather if centaurs are skilled with bows and arrows. She replies that the Gale clan has the best archers. Richard, browsing the weapon store through his window, checks the bows and arrows section and notes that the equipment is expensive. Supplying soldiers is costly. He makes a purchase, and a purple bow with a white feathered arrow appears out of the light. He hands it to Heather, asking her to try it out. Heather, a bit surprised, asks if he uses magic. He responds with a smile, saying it's just a little trick. She takes the bow, knocks the arrow, draws it back, and shoots at a tree, or rather, at a bee flying nearby. The bee is split in two. Richard praises her, saying her technique is excellent, and as expected, these centaurs will strengthen the Highland Fortress's long-range defense. Heather bows and thanks Sir Richard for letting her use such a heavy bow, saying it's been a long time since she last did. Richard smiles back, laughs, and says she can start training with it tomorrow. Suddenly, Rudo rushes over and says something is wrong. He kneels and reports that they've found the caravan reinforcements, but it looks like they've been attacked. Richard immediately calls Heather to investigate. Annie, seeing the wounded, begins to cry, calling the attackers vile jackals. When Richard arrives, he asks Annie what happened. She explains that it looks like all the reinforcements have been wiped out. Bodies are scattered everywhere. Richard suggests sending the caravan back to Solon, saying the Highland Fortress is no longer safe. One of the wounded soldiers suggests taking the healthy men and horses, arguing that even if they encounter jackals, they'll be able to fend them off. But Annie disagrees, insisting she can't abandon the wounded members of the caravan who risked their lives for her. Richard, with a greedy smile, says that in such a dangerous situation, the rent will go up, and what he sees is worth 2,000 gold. Feeling defeated, Annie tells him to do as he pleases. Meanwhile, Heather examines the spears and tells Richard that the spear smells like Chinese pine, and that the attackers seem to have forged the tips themselves. Richard inspects the sharp end and remarks that it's hard to believe the locals or savages could have done this. Annie responds, saying that there are more savages than they might think. She mentions the powerful tribes in the far north, where large groups of thousands of adult soldiers often fight for territory and forge their own weapons. Annie adds that the strength of these tribes is far greater than that of the local savages. Heather turns to her and asks if she means the caravan was attacked by ice natives. Annie confirms this, expressing concern that the arrival of the ice natives changes everything. Richard agrees, saying it's clear the ice natives have joined the war. Gunther, with ambition in his voice, suggests that they should all come at once so he can take them down in one blow. Richard nods, saying Gunther is right. They'll just capture everyone in one go. 10 days later, the centaurs rush to Richard, reporting that they've spotted the enemy. He asks where they are now. The centaur explains that the enemy has set up camp at the foot of the mountain, about 50 miles away, and it looks like they plan to attack tomorrow. Richard, pleased with this news, says they've been waiting a long time, and now the moment has finally arrived. Richard fiercely draws his sword and commands his army to prepare for battle. He tells them to cut off the enemy's heads and use them as bowls. The barbarian army moves forward with excitement, shouting with their weapons drawn as centaurs ready their bows and stomp their hooves in anticipation. As Richard straps on his armor, he feels its heavy weight. Annie turns to him, asking about his strategy and how he plans to act. He says they will first launch 2 rounds of arrows and then charge. He believes that if they can kill 100 enemies, the rest will retreat on their own. Rudo and Annie are shocked at this straightforward plan. Richard, standing confidently, assures her that everything will be fine and tells her not to worry. Meanwhile, a group of goblins marches through the mountains, led by their jackal leader riding a large jackal beast. The leader, looking at the small number of soldiers, says that if this is all the Lord has, then they're simply asking for defeat. He then turns to the kobold chief, saying they need to end this battle quickly. The kobold replies that there's no need to rush because their leader, Lord Richard, is quite formidable. Through binoculars, they see Richard standing beside Windchaser. The enemy leader notices the large number of soldiers gathered this time and decides they must crush them. Without hesitation, the jackals and goblins launch a direct assault on the fortress. Richard, ready for battle, reflects on how life was given to them by God, but sadly, they do not cherish it. He raises his weapon high and commands everyone to prepare for war. Meanwhile, the jackal army charges forward with orders to bite their enemies to death. Heather pulls back an arrow in her bow, and the other centaurs follow her lead. When the command to fire is given, a volley of arrows is released all at once. One arrow hits a jackal, killing it instantly, but a goblin deflects another with its shield. The two huge armies clash, each determined to kill the other. Goblins swing swords and throw spears wildly, but Windchaser deflects their attacks with ease. The barbarians fight bravely, showing no fear in the face of the enemy. As the distance between the two armies closes, the ground suddenly cracks open, and a dragon goblin emerges. Richard tells Windchaser to show everyone his strength. Windchaser leaps into the air, crashing down with great force and crushing the goblins below. Richard strikes one goblin with a large fork-like weapon, and cuts down another with an axe. Russell and Gunther take turns cutting through the goblins, ordering their forces to leave no one alive. Windchaser crushes jackals with its paws. 2 goblins with weapons charge at Richard, but he pulls out his weapon, which transforms into nunchucks. He deflects their attack but falls down in the process, realizing these goblins are stronger than he expected. As 3 more goblins attack him at once, he quickly takes them all down. While he is fighting, Gunther and Russell are amazed at his strength, saying that the Lord is almost as powerful as the devil. Watching from above with binoculars, the Jackal leader and the Kobold chief see that their soldiers have been wiped out. The Kobold panics, exclaiming how terrible the situation is and wondering how this could happen. The Jackal tells the sorcerer to cast a spell. Meanwhile, the shaman begins chanting strange and familiar spells, summoning fire from a pool of lava. The 2 leaders are pleased, confident that Richard's army will be destroyed. Richard turns around and sees the fireball, realizing it's the shaman's magic. Under the shaman's command, the fireball transforms into a fiery dragon. He warns everyone to be careful. He gets ready to block the attack and raises his weapon, but it unexpectedly breaks. He didn't anticipate the heat wave from the fire to be so strong. The fire spreads everywhere, causing the barbarians to feel afraid as the shaman's spells are very powerful. One of the barbarians says it's the first time he's been injured. Richard states that they need to figure out how to deal with the shaman since it seems like she controls the fire with a wand. Heather approaches Richard and asks if he's okay. He tells her she arrived just in time and points to the shaman, asking if she can shoot from such a long distance. Heather replies that she can do it easily. Heather gives the command, and the centaurs pull arrows onto their bows. As soon as Heather says fire, everyone releases their arrows. She orders them to keep shooting, and they obey. A large number of arrows fly toward the enemy. The Jackal calls it a rain of arrows, and tells the goblins to protect the shaman by the fire. Goblins with shields rush to guard the shaman. Richard swings and throws his spear while ordering a surprise attack. The Jackal believes everything will be fine if they protect the shaman, but mid-sentence, the spear hits him directly. The force of the spear knocks him back, taking down the goblins guarding the shaman. The shaman's wand breaks, and the fireball falls onto their own army of goblins and jackals. Goblins are burned by the fire and collapse to the ground. Richard notices the fire spreading around them. The Kobold observer tries to help Chief Jackal but quickly realizes that he's already dead. He turns to the shaman and asks what they should do next. The shaman stirs something in a bowl, and without the wand, a purple flame-like energy appears. Thinking the battle is over, Richard says it's time to clean up, but suddenly, he sees the goblins who were previously dead, rising up from the ground. They've been possessed by the shaman's magic, which Richard realizes is making them bloodthirsty. The goblins and jackals stand up suddenly and attack without using weapons. Richard swings his sword at a jackal, slicing its body into pieces. He kills 3 attacking goblins in the same way and continues moving forward. Gunther is also fighting. He reaches the shaman and says that he has finally caught them. The kobold admits defeat, and the shaman sits on the kobold's shoulders, trying to escape. He asks if they really think they can run away. He takes off his helmet and throws it at them, knocking the shaman off the kobold's back. He approaches the shaman and menacingly says that he has caught him. The shaman turns his head, revealing that it's actually a witch. He laughs, saying he didn't expect the shaman to be a woman. While holding the shaman by the tail, he asks Gunther what happened to Nate, one of his barbarians. She replies that Nate has a serious wound and needs medical help. Richard throws the shaman to the ground, saying that she's killed many people, and orders her to save Nate. The shaman looks away and explains that she was forced to attack Richard's army, asking not to be called Hey, but by her name, Modir. With a threatening expression, he asks if she dares to argue and warns that he will make her suffer in every way possible. The shaman immediately panics, raising her hands in surrender and agrees to help. She casts a spell near Nate, who suddenly wakes up, groaning and moving his hand. Everyone watches closely, their faces filled with surprise and anticipation. The shaman, leaning back, looks exhausted and says she is tired. The barbarians surround Nate, amazed that he is fully healed, and his wounds have disappeared as if they never existed. Richard realizes that Modir is powerful in both destruction and healing. He decides that she could be a valuable asset at the Highland Fortress. Gunther then asks him what they should do with the jackals and goblins. He responds that they need to clean up the battlefield and make all the survivors submit to him. One barbarian notes that they have caught a lot this time. He looks out the system window at the many requests and is pleased to see several upgrades. Russell, the hero, is upgraded to a first-class warrior with an axe and gains 2 character points. Gunther, distracted by his question, asks what they'll do with the witch Modir lying quietly on the ground. Richard picks up the kobold by the leg and orders him to take the witch with him and find their base. Richard splits Heather's leveling points between strength and speed, deciding this will work. Heather informs him that they couldn't get any information from the magician. He asks if they tried torturing her. She replies that they used all sorts of threats and torture, but she didn't say anything. He confidently says catching a phoenix is not as easy as catching a chicken and offers to show them how it's done. He stands up and walks toward them. The kobold is tied up by its legs and arms, hanging against the wall. The shaman tries to rebel, threatening to turn them all into insects if they hit her again. Richard and Heather enter the room. The shaman immediately sits down, calling him Pompeian, and asks him to control his subordinates, who don't respect her. Richard smiles, calls her Hey, again, and demands to know the location of her base. The witch, annoyed, yells that she's already told them she won't say anything and that she has the blood of a dragon. In the middle of her speech, Richard punches her in the face, sending her flying. Heather is shocked by his sudden action. He lifts the shaman up and asks again where her base is. She quickly responds that it's in the mountains, 200 miles away. He then asks how many warriors are left in their tribe. She immediately says there are none left, as they've all been defeated. He warns her menacingly that if she's lying, he'll break her teeth. She panics and insists she's telling the truth, explaining that all the soldiers went to war and only old women and children are left. He then asks how many spells she knows. With wide eyes, almost in tears, she explains that there are many different shamans in the wild, and that, having the blood of a red dragon, she has mastered fire magic completely. She adds that the Minotaur shamans can control the element of earth, create avalanches, and destroy the ground, while the troll shamans control trees and plants, killing all living things. He thinks about this and remarks that the wilderness is much more dangerous than he expected. He calls Heather and tells her to find Gunther and come up with an attack plan. The barbarian asks what they should do with the kobold and the witch. He says they are useless and orders them to be buried behind the mountain. Shaman quickly protests, insisting she is still useful and can help them. He asks how she could possibly be of help. She replies that when she came to the Highland Fortress, she saw two giant monsters who had the unique talents of a shaman. She claims that as a shaman herself, she can train them, turning them into powerful and unpredictable Shura shamans with an endless supply of mana. 2 days later, Richard plans to demolish the Highland Fortress. The slaves he brought back have been working tirelessly to rebuild it. When Heather asks about his plans, Richard explains that after the demolition, they will begin constructing defensive structures around the fortress. Then, they will use granite to reinforce the foundation, making the entire structure much stronger. This time, Richard is determined to make the fortress the most formidable and unbreakable castle in the wilderness. He gives Heather a new mission, to lead a small team to scout out the enemy base the shaman had mentioned and confirm if her claims are true. When she asks if he wants her to eliminate the enemy forces, he makes it clear she only needs to gather information. The village is mostly populated by elderly women, the weak, and children, so she and the centaurs will need to be quick and efficient. Heather agrees, mentioning that 2 days ago, she felt the wind beneath her feet as if it was urging her forward. She assures him she would lead the team and return promptly with the report. He cautioned her to stay vigilant and ensure her team's safe return. After sending Heather on her mission, he heads to the back mountain to check on the trolls' training progress. Seeing they aren't tapping into their magical potential, he questions whether their training had gone deep enough. So far, there hasn't been any noticeable improvement. The shaman feels Richard seem unaware of her true power, so she decides to cast a spell. The magic immediately alerts the trolls, causing them to instinctively awaken a counter skill. She informed Richard that one of the trolls had activated the stoneskin art skill. She adds that to avoid being hit, the troll had also developed the ability to turn invisible. The awakening of shamans focuses on the harmony between time, place, and relationships, which explains why the other troll hadn't awakened any special skills yet. Richard considers the ability to turn invisible might seem a bit underwhelming, but at least it is still a magical skill. Just then, Annie called out to Richard from behind. He asked if they had returned safely to Corin City. She replied that they were planning to transport some goods for trade with the Darwinian tribe and happened to cross paths with him. Richard approached the cart and inspected its contents, which were packed with coal. He asked why there was such a great trade in coal. Annie explained that they used the coal to trade with the dwarves for gold coins and fur. Aware of this, Richard asked why the dwarves needed so much coal. She explained that last year the dwarves had discovered an iron ore vein in Lake Bayou, 150 miles west of High Mountain Fortress, which was why they had been purchasing large quantities of coal. At that moment, Richard suddenly received a letter from the Lord of Corin City, ordering all nobles expanding their territories outside to return to the city. Almost immediately, Heather came running towards him, looking distressed. Richard was surprised by her early return from the shaman tribes 400 miles away, and feared she might have been injured or attacked along the way. Heather reported that there was no immediate threat in the Jackal and Shaman's tribe, though they did come across some injured soldiers. However, on their way back, they passed through a dwarf village and found piles of dwarf corpses scattered across the ground. As they wondered who could have committed such a brutal attack, a huge black figure appeared before them. Without hesitation, Richard identified the attackers as bearmen. Heather was surprised and asked how Richard knew. Richard explained that he had learned from the letter sent by the Lord of Corin City, which warned everyone to return to the city because a large wave of bearmen had been spotted moving south, putting many nobles in danger. But Richard, a proud warrior, had no intention of fleeing like a coward. Instead, he ordered Gunther and the others to rest and prepare for what was to come. Richard then turned to Annie and remarked that her business with the dwarves seemed unfinished. He suggested she hand over the coal instead. Annie was confused by his request, but Richard quickly clarified. He needed the coal because he had built a factory and was crafting his own weapons for the fortress. He emphasized that they needed a steady supply of weapons to face the unknown enemies they might encounter. Richard then asked Gunther about the weapon he had commissioned. Gunther confirmed they had built it according to Richard's specifications. Richard moved to unveil it, revealing a massive flaming cannon before their eyes. He explained that such a weapon existed only in his true homeland, leaving Annie and the shaman stunned by the sight of the advanced technology. As night fell, Richard and his group arrived at the dwarf village. The ground was littered with corpses and marked with the footprints of bearmen. Heather shuddered, recalling how the bearmen had come in large numbers, and they had only survived by fleeing as fast as they could. Richard reflected that if he hadn't upgraded the speed attribute of his centaur tribe, they might not have made it out alive. Richard instructed his men to search the area for anything useful, but they came back empty-handed. Annie, standing to the side, calmly remarked that bearmen were a violent and greedy race that wouldn't leave anything of value behind. Richard, however, disagreed, believing that value could mean different things to different people. He suddenly spotted a jar filled with a dark liquid inside a tent. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was a jar of soy sauce. It seemed the bearmen hadn't realized the worth of soy sauce. Annie, intrigued, asked what was so delightful about it. Richard replied that if they took the soy sauce back to Corin City, they could open a restaurant and make a fortune. His entrepreneurial spirit even impressed Annie, a seasoned merchant. Later, Richard decided they would camp at the site overnight. Rudo asked his father why they were staying when they had only come to scout out the enemy. He insisted they should leave only after seeing the bearmen themselves. During the expedition, Annie appeared worried. She suspected that the bearmen and the dwarves were locked in a conflict and thought it best to avoid getting involved. However, she struggled to understand why Richard was engaging in this war. Richard explained that since she seemed to grasp the situation, she must also understand why the bearmen had started this war. Sue quickly realized that the two tribes were likely fighting over control of the iron mine. In a time when primitive weapons ruled, whoever controlled the resources had the advantage. If the bearmen and the dwarves could compete for it, why couldn't they seize it themselves? Annie still tried to persuade Richard, arguing that a large-scale war like this might be too much for the high mountain fortress army to handle. Richard replied confidently, questioning why she had followed them if she believed it was too dangerous. He reminded her that the strength of the high mountain fortress was far greater than it had been in the past. Just then, Gunther and Russell arrived with 3 cannons and a magical group of 3 wizards. Richard pointed out that they also had brave and skilled barbarian warriors and an archery unit. He continued to persuade Annie, stating that with her support, they could win this war. He believed that if he could win her over, he could establish connections with the dwarves. So, he proposed a deal. He would give her half of the iron ore if she agreed to cooperate. Annie accepted the offer. With his entire army lined up, Richard drew his dragon's lair sword and stood atop a high tower. He shouted that this battle was not only for the high mountain fortress, but also for themselves. They must become the unyielding force that could crush their enemies. His words ignited a fierce determination in the soldiers below, who were now fired up and ready for battle. Under the cover of night, Richard led his army to the dwarves' castle. He had planned to strike first, but a group of rabbit folk got there ahead of him. He quickly ordered his men to hide. Watching the rabbits raiding the castle, he wondered why rabbit folk were involved in a battle between the bearmen and the dwarves. Annie explained that these rabbits were vassals of the bearmen. Gunther told him that powerful races often recruit weaker ones as vassals, forcing them to do menial tasks. Richard, surprised by this revelation, asked why they hadn't told him sooner. They replied that they didn't expect a lord like him to be unaware. Feeling embarrassed, he noticed the little shaman nearby and playfully tapped her head, telling her to bow. By then, the rabbits had already climbed over the wall, unnoticed by the dwarven guards. The rabbits quickly gained the upper hand and launched a final assault. The guards shouted that enemies were approaching from Bayou Lake. Hearing this, all the wall's defenses were alerted. Believing the bearmen had started their attack, the battle began, with the dwarves shooting arrows at the rabbits. The rabbits defended themselves with shields as they rushed toward the gate, crossing the lake. Less strategic dwarves opened the gate to seize the rabbit attackers. Seeing this chance, the rabbit chief ordered a full-on assault. Suddenly, a cannon blast sent a large group of rabbits flying. To the chief's surprise, Richard stood in the distance with a smug look, ready to take his turn in the battle. The enraged rabbit chief, thinking reinforcements had arrived for the dwarves, turned the attack toward Richard and charged at him. But he was ready for the attack, and the rabbits were no match for his barbarian army.